Non appena vediamo il governo come qualcosa di separato da noi e semplicemente come ciò che ci fornisce i beni che abbiamo diritto di ricevere come cittadini, allora abbiamo rinunciato all'idea della cittadinanza come un processo davvero attivo di svolgimento del lavoro dell'autogoverno. E a quel punto, in un certo senso, abbiamo aperto la strada alla fine della democrazia, permettendo a qualche elite speciale o a qualche individuo di dire «lo farò io per voi».
Benvenuti, io sono Massimo Polidoro e state per ascoltare il Gomitolo Atomico, il mio video podcast che va online ogni martedì sul mio canale YouTube. Se volete vedere questa puntata, oltre ad ascoltarla, la trovate su YouTube insieme a tutte le altre. E ora, buon ascolto! Che cosa può insegnarci il passato della democrazia sul futuro? In che modo le città-stato greche possono rappresentare una lente per riflettere sul potere, la cittadinanza, la fragilità dei governi attuali? Oggi in questa puntata speciale del Gomitolo Atomico, vedete che siamo in trasferta, siamo a Berna, incontreremo qualcuno che ha proprio dedicato la vita a studiare così l'immaginazione politica delle città-stato greche. Il suo lavoro attraversa la scienza politica, l'economia, l'archeologia, la filosofia, ridefinendo il modo in cui studiamo la democrazia antica. Si tratta di Josiah Ober, docente a Stanford tra i massimi esperti al mondo di democrazia greca antica. Quest'anno il Premio Internazionale Balzan ha visto nella sua ricerca un punto di riferimento nel campo. Come già sapete, ogni anno il Premio Balzan riconosce alcune delle menti più brillanti del nostro tempo, scienziati, studiosi, pensatori che hanno ampliato i confini della conoscenza e trasformato il modo in cui noi comprendiamo il mondo e noi stessi. E noi abbiamo oggi la fortuna davvero di poter conversare, poter incontrare i vincitori del Premio Balzan 2025, figure di spicco che incarnano l'eccellenza nei loro campi, dalla fisica alla storia dell'arte, dalla medicina alla filosofia politica. Sono conversazioni in inglese, tutte quante con i sottotitoli, e vi assicuro che ne vale veramente la pena. Questi incontri mi hanno colpito e stimolato perché sono persone che hanno dedicato tutta la vita a cercare risposte e soprattutto a formulare nuove domande e domande migliori. Spero davvero che accada lo stesso anche con voi. Prima di incontrare il professor Ober ho voluto chiedere a Christoph Riedweg, professore emerito di filologia classica all'Università di Zurigo, oltre che componente del Comitato Generale dei Premi Balzan, di dirci qualcosa di più sul vincitore e sul suo contributo. Chi è dunque Josiah Ober e qual è il cuore del suo contributo?
Josiah Ober è la persona in assoluto nel mondo di oggi, di tutti i ricercatori che stanno ancora vivendo, che ha contribuito la più grande parte all'indagine, alla ricerca della democrazia ateniese.
Che cosa ha reso il suo lavoro così distintivo rispetto ad altri ricercatori sul campo?
È quello che lo contraddistingue, che sempre prende sì il materiale tutto in considerazione fin dai ultimi dettagli, però dopo fa delle grandi tesi anche che sono sempre molto accattivanti anche al di fuori del mondo classico, perché lui per esempio prende integra nelle sue riflessioni anche game theory e altre teorie delle social sciences, ma anche per esempio Gramsci in suo volume molto importante su masse elite, sulla egemonia ideologica delle masse e tutto ciò, quindi veramente un ricercatore di spicco che non ha paragone nel mondo.
In che modo la ricerca di Ober ha cambiato, potrebbe cambiare il modo in cui noi guardiamo il mondo?
Questa è una difficile domanda, però ho anche per me fatto una raccolta di tantissime sue osservazioni che rimangono enormemente utili per oggi. Per esempio anche che la partecipazione di un gruppo più grande possibile nei processi di interazione e di azione politica è fondamentale, anche per poi avere un grande riservatoio di conoscenze, di saperi che comunque nella logica democratica sono distribuite ovunque e quindi quindi si deve cogliere tutto per avere un grande successo. E poi lui dice anche che la democrazia si impara sul territorio, per così dire. Dunque i demo erano essenziali e lì tutti erano coinvolti e quindi tutti avevano già accolto durante gli anni un certo sapere democratico.
Il Premio Balzan riconosce spesso ricerche che uniscono rigore e visione. In che modo quella di Ober, se vogliamo, ha queste caratteristiche?
Direi in tantissimi modi. È un punto che si vede già nella sua carriera, dunque lui ha iniziato come storico dell'antichità e alla fine è diventato un professore non solo di filosofia ma innanzitutto anche di scienze politiche e quindi ha sempre dato quindi delle ispirazioni alla gente e forse uno dei libri più importanti in questa logica che secondo lui è nato un po' dall'esperienza anche della primavera araba, questo Demopolis, dove ha fatto un tentativo di separare il liberalismo, che per le nostre democrazie è assolutamente fondamentale, di una struttura democratica prima del liberalismo, che forse potrebbe anche essere quindi realizzato nel mondo arabo e in altri contesti.
Perché oggi è importante sostenere ricerche come quella di Josiah Ober?
Per me lo studio dell'antichità è come uno specchio, per così dire. Si guarda in questo specchio e non nella logica di idealizzare l'antichità, ma piuttosto lo specchio della creatura umana. In questo senso è una ricerca molto antropologica, perché riconosciamo i problemi dell'antichità, come la schiavitù, come anche la situazione delle donne, e poi guardiamo nello specchio il nostro proprio tempo e vediamo comunque non parliamo di schiavitù, ma abbiamo il fenomeno ovunque. Dico sempre, se noi compriamo un t-shirt per 5 euro è basato sulla schiavitù, questo è chiaro. E quindi vediamo bene anche i nostri punti oscuri se facciamo questo paragone e quindi questo ci aiuta.
La scelta delle aree del Premio Balzan spesso riflette interessi nel quello che succede nel mondo, insomma, in che modo le ricerche di Ober hanno queste caratteristiche.
Ma è chiaro anche se guardiamo questo indice Standard Gold della democrazia, il VUDEM, che in questi giorni viviamo un grande cambiamento e mentre dopo il crollo del muro di Berlino andava tutto il mondo in direzione della democrazia, adesso stiamo tornando in direzione di autocrazia. Non era mai un numero così grande che vive in autocrazie come oggi e siamo tornati al 1978. Secondo il VUDEM. E quindi riflettere su quali erano i fattori di successo della ricerca del mondo antico, che comunque ha dato il nome anche alla nostra democrazia, e democrazia, quindi il potere del popolo. Che conto, quindi di guardare bene è come un case study che possiamo guardare, un esperimento diciamo nel laboratorio per meglio capire cosa ha funzionato lì, cosa non ha funzionato qui, perché per me è essenziale che la maggior parte dei problemi che vediamo oggi possono anche già essere individuati nell'antichità, in particolar modo durante la grande guerra fratricida del Peloponneso, dove c'era populismo, c'era l'abuso del giudiziario per perseguire gli nemici, c'era questo creare emozioni che la gente pensa questa è l'idea, non vale nulla, dobbiamo cacciarla via, e tutto ciò c'era anche già qui, e la corruzione che adesso per esempio negli Stati Uniti vediamo sulla grande scena e nessuno se ne fa carico veramente. E quindi di studiare questi modelli ci aiuta a riflettere, a vedere più chiaro i problemi che ci sono anche.
Siamo dunque pronti per ascoltare Josiah Ober, appunto qui a Berna, dove riceve il premio, per chiedergli che cosa una comunità di contadini e scalpellini, come gli antichi greci, insomma, può insegnare a società dotate di armi nucleari, governi algoritmici e una crescente crisi di fiducia. Nella nostra conversazione, dunque, parleremo di ciò che fa vivere una democrazia e di ciò che la fa morire. Welcome, Professor Ober.
Thank you so much. Such a joy to be here.
It's a pleasure, really an honor. So we will start with a very easy question. Is democracy dying?
I hope not. I believe not. Democracy is always in process. It's always either being invented or challenged, sometimes temporarily overthrown, recreated, rediscovered. So we're at a time now, I think, of crisis, potentially, but I don't think that means death. I think that means that it's a challenge and that democracy needs to be able to rethink itself. We have to rethink how it is that a citizenry can govern itself in really new conditions, technological conditions, sociological conditions. So always a challenge, but I think not dead yet.
So what does studying a small city-state from 2,500 years ago reveal about the problems facing modern societies, modern democracies?
So the core question of democracy really is can a community of citizens, that is, individuals who have defined themselves as the rulers of themselves, have resisted the idea or rejected the idea that any boss, any dictator or tyrant or king has the legitimate authority to rule over them. How does that community rule itself? That's the core question. So if we imagine very small communities of perhaps a few dozen individuals, for example, distant ancestors who were foragers before we had civilization, before cities, then it's quite easy to imagine ruling ourselves because we talk with each other around the campfire and we can respect each other's special skills, special knowledge, and get on with it. As soon as we get larger scale, once we have agricultural communities, we get cities, we have really larger scale, it gets really hard. And then hierarchy seems to be the solution. We'll just have somebody organize things because there's too many of us to organize ourselves. At least so it seems for some time. So ancient Greece is an example of an early, well-documented example of a community that rejected the idea that there should be one boss, and yet was much larger than these small foraging communities with hundreds of thousands of individuals, tens of thousands of potential citizens. So how did they work it out? So that was really the question that I posed myself at the beginning of my career, and I've been thinking about ever since. But it's really the same general question as we have now. We're way above the scale of talking to each other around the campfire every evening. We have to solve, in a sense, the same problem that the Athenians solved, but at even a much larger scale.
You mentioned, I think in an interview, that you were a particularly driven student growing up. When did your fascination with history start? And when did ancient democracy become an intellectual, let's say, obsession?
So I was not a particularly good student when I was at the high school gymnasium stage. I was very distracted by many other things. Let's just say it was the 1960s, and I was engaged with the 1960s. I started university in 1971, almost by accident. I wasn't very serious at that time, but I was lucky enough to have stumbled into a course in ancient Greek history. I had a book when I was a kid on Greek mythology, so I thought, I kind of like that as much as anything. And so I got into this course in Greek history. And the professor was so profoundly serious. I think that's what struck me. He believed that the study of the ancient Greek world was of immense importance and projected that in a way that I hadn't experienced before. I became fascinated by the idea that one could be so in love with a time in the past. And so I thought, this is so interesting. And he presented the Greeks in a way that I thought, really, they're interesting. So I went to him at the end of the course and I said, well, I've decided I want to be like you. I'd like to be a professor of Greek history. And he looked at me and he said, no. No, he said, it's not going to work. So I had hair down to here. I looked like, somebody from, the time.
60s, yeah.
And I said, it's not going to work. You won't do the work. So I asked, well, just in case I did do the work, what would the work be? And he said, well, first learn Greek. And so I started to learn Greek and did one thing and another. And by the end of my undergraduate time, he said, you should think about graduate school, a PhD program. So I said, well, what's that? Because I wasn't, explained to me what that was. Okay, I'll try that. And so he sent me on to work with the professor that he had worked with, so then began my really serious study. So once again, it was sort of an accident. It was falling in love without expecting to.
A lucky accident. So why and how did democracy arise in ancient Greece?
So democracy arises in stages. So we have to look back to really the time of the Bronze Age, thinking about 1200 BCE, a time in which there were, in the Greek world, palace structures. The society was organized around kings and their subjects, had been, in a sense, inherited from the great civilizations further to the east of Egypt, of Mesopotamia. So at that point, Greece didn't look very different from other parts of the developing world in terms of its political structure. But then around 1100 BCE, there was a collapse. Complicated reasons, disease, invasion, and so on. At any rate, the whole palace structure just imploded. And the civilization of Greece returned to a very simple level. It was a catastrophe at the time. The population dropped dramatically. The level of culture dropped dramatically. But it wiped out the hierarchies. And then for several hundred years, the Greek world was largely, not entirely, but largely cut off from the more advanced civilizations to the east. And the Greek communities began to reinvent themselves in ways it's very difficult to trace exactly, because it's a time in which writing was lost. The palaces had writing, but the writing was by scribes who worked for the king. And so there was no more work because no more kings. And so no reason for writing. By the time that writing was reinvented or re-imported from the East as alphabetic form of writing, something had happened such that the Greek communities that coalesced were no longer dominated by a single individual or a single hierarchy, but there were aristocratic communities emerging, so not democracy yet. There was a conflict between the aristocrats who were increasingly pushing the poorer of their fellow Athenians into a condition of servitude. The fellow Athenians weren't going to accept this. The beginning of what was probably going to be a civil war in Athens. And the civil war was averted by an agreement that was brokered by the statesman Solon between the wealthy and the rest of the citizens that left the wealthy in control of much of their wealth, but resisted the idea, in fact, eliminated the idea that the wealthy had the right to dominate the rest, to enslave them. So with Solon and this bargain, really, between the elite and the ordinary citizens, that the elite would not be allowed to enslave, but would be allowed to possess their property, the possibility then for some new form of government, a radically new form of government, was in place, but hadn't yet been fully put into place. The years after Solon, in the middle of the 6th century BCE, there was a takeover by a tyrant, which had happened in many other of the Greek city-states at this point. But the tyranny was never really fully consolidated. By the end of the 6th century, the tyrant had been expelled, partly through the intervention of the city-state of Sparta, which was by that time the most powerful city-state in the Greek world. The question really was then, what was going to be the structure of Athenian society? There was a conflict between two aristocratic families, one of them led by a man named Cleisthenes, who was not doing so well in the conflict because he had less good connections with the powerful state of Sparta. And so he did something very radical. According to the historian Herodotus, he brought the ordinary citizens into his coalition, into his special group of friends. Presumably by offering to promote a new set of laws that would really enfranchise the ordinary citizens. His opponent, an aristocrat named Isagoras, thought this was a disaster, called in his Spartan friends. The Spartans sent a small army to Athens to rectify the situation. Cleisthenes and his closest allies had to flee from Athens. The Spartans and the Athenians who were working with the Spartans then sought to set up a new aristocratic government that would permanently rule Athens under the control of Sparta ultimately. But at this point, there was an uprising by the ordinary citizens of Athens who, according to Herodotus, refused this new order. They besieged the Spartan army, the small army that the Spartans had sent, on the Acropolis of Athens for 3 days. After 3 days, the Spartans had to surrender, were expelled. Cleisthenes was recalled to Athens. And at this point, what's going to happen? Cleisthenes will declare himself to be tyrant. No, we don't want a tyrant. We just got rid of a tyrant. He'll declare himself to be the leader of an aristocracy. No, the whole reason of the uprising was to stop an aristocracy. Okay, Cleisthenes, what will it be? And make it fast, because the Spartans are very irritated of having their king and his small army expelled from Athens. So it has to be really put into place quickly. That's the origin of democracy. It is the uprising, the self-conscious decision by a mass of ordinary citizens that they would not be ruled by a gang of aristocrats or an individual, and then the plan by a leader, Cleisthenes, to do something about it, have to come up with a real plan. And the plan was the new, we call it the Constitution, but the new set of rules by which the Athenians would be organized. It was really a plan for democracy, although nobody had a word for it yet.
And here we are around 8th
This
century.
is now in 508 BCE, the very end of the 6th century.
You call the golden age of ancient Greece Greek efflorescence, is that correct? What conditions allowed demographics, the economy, creativity, and civic innovation to explode all at once?
When we start at the late 6th century, at this moment of Athenian revolution that creates the democratic system, there are changes going on already in the Greek world. By now, alphabetic writing is common. There's a good deal of trade going on between Greek city-states, and then from Greek city-states to Egypt, to the Levant, over to the Western Mediterranean. By the time of Aristotle, there were well over 1,000 Greek city-states across the Mediterranean world. They had different forms of government, but many of them were democratic or democratic-like. They weren't the kind of fixed, stable hierarchies that we see in other societies. They were in different conditions. They had different resources. They had different agricultural conditions across the extent of the Greek world. And they had reasons both to compete with one another as city-states, but also to cooperate with one another because they were trading the specialized products that each of these different city-states were developing. That allows for the kind of conditions that created economic growth over time. So it's really it's a finely balanced thing. Too much violent competition and you'd crash the whole system. Too much cooperation established by a central government and you tend to restrain the creativity, the innovation, the new forms of doing things and producing things that allows for this efflorescence. We sometimes call the Greek miracle, but it's not a miracle. I mean, it's quite explicable by reference to both the social and the political organization of the Greek world, ultimately, I think, a world that had broken with the kind of strict hierarchies that we see in much of the world through much of human history.
You say that the citizens were ready to fight for their democracy because citizenship meant a real power and everyday participation in public life. Today, most people only touch politics at the ballot box every few years. Was city-state democracy simply about population size, or was there something deeper in its civic design?
Size is important. Tens of thousands of citizens is different from tens of millions of citizens. So we need different kinds of technology, as it were, for contemporary citizenship representation, for example. But I think more important is a recognition that citizenship is something that is essentially involved with responsibilities as well as rights. I think that one of the great successes of the modern world is the recognition that citizenship comes with really important rights. And indeed, those rights in some ways extend beyond citizenship. We think of them as human rights. But I think that the success of rights, attachment to rights, has come at the expense of a recognition that every right imposes duties upon us to defend those rights. And eventually, if we see our lives as simply a series of rights that are owed to us by the government, and detached from the responsibilities that we have to each other as citizens to defend and establish and maintain the conditions of our self-governing system, then we, I think, become detached from what democracy really is, which is the self-governance of citizens by citizens, sustaining conditions of self-governance, so that each of us does have the right to live our lives to some extent as we choose, but also to work together to create public goods, the common goods that are necessary for our lives together, without depending on an external government to give them to us. As soon as we see government as something that is separate from us and simply what delivers us the goods that are our right to have as citizens, then we've given up on the idea of citizenship as a really active process of doing the work of self-governance. And at that point, we've opened the way, in a sense, to the end of democracy, to some special elite or some individual to say, I'll do it for you. At that point, really, we've lost what I think the Greek Democrats did not lose, which was this recognition that citizenship is us and must be done by us.
In fact, when we hear calls for more direct democracy, and in practice, that language sometimes risks being used by leaders who say, I am the people, carrying the risk that challenging them means opposing the will of the people. So direct democracy can empower citizens or become a populist weapon. How can we distinguish between the two?
Exactly so. So the problem that democracy can devolve into tyranny through a kind of populist system wherein the tyrant claims to represent the people directly was a threat that the Greeks were well aware of. Plato, writing in the Republic, gives a description of how democracy degenerates into tyranny that's really terrifyingly reminiscent of at least some developments in the 21st century. So this is a constant threat, and it needs to be resisted by citizens who are experienced in and well-educated in the kind of knowledge and the kind of skills that are needed by citizens to, in fact, govern themselves. So one of the things that we need, I think, to recover in modernity is the recognition that we as citizens not only have the responsibility for governing ourselves, we have the responsibility for educating ourselves generation by generation in the background knowledge. How does this thing work? How do our institutions work? Where did they come from? What undermines them? What are the skills that we need in terms of being able to talk with one another, to learn from one another, to treat one another as what Aristotle called civic friends rather than enemies because you're from the other political party. So this return to civic education, I think, is going to be the deciding factor in whether democracy survives its current challenges. How to give citizens the right kind of knowledge, the right kind of skill sets, really the right disposition, the right character, such that they can, in fact, do the work of citizenship, not only have the right desire to do it, but have the capacity to do it. This is what we have to, I think, regain. And this is something we can learn from the ancients.
Do you think that the Greeks understood something about human rationality, decision-making that might surprise us?
I think so. I think that one of the things that has long been characteristic or regarded as characteristic of the classical Greek world, the period we've been talking about, the period of the democracy, is this attachment to rationality, to reason. And one of the ways to think about rationality and reason is the capacity to engage in decision-making in ways that is at once strategic, that is effective in terms of getting what you want out of the choices that you make and the actions that you make, you as an individual and we as a community, but also ethical, in that we're aiming at an end that is one that is public. It's not just for me. It's not my ends using my strategic reason in order to get from you just what I want, but it's us together acting rationally, coming up with decisions that we make together that gain us the public goods, the common goods, the basic security, the basic welfare that we need to live our lives as individuals, as a community. So I think this really was something that was very self-conscious in the Greek world, at least by the time of Plato and Aristotle.
When politics turns to zero-sum thinking, cooperation collapses, of course. So we're unfortunately seeing it right now, for example, with Trump's tariffs. Why does zero-sum thinking corrode democracy?
So there are really two ways to think about decision-making. One is a zero-sum game in which everything that you gain, I lose, and vice versa. So if we think of, say, a football match, one side wins, the other side loses. Straightforward. Then there's another way of thinking about how we make decisions that is thought of as a kind of bargain, in which you come to the bargaining table and I come to the bargaining table, each with our interests, each with what we want to get out of it, but we recognize that neither of us is going to get everything that we want, but both of us will do better if we come to some agreement. So I've sometimes used the analogy of buying a used car. Now, you go to buy a used car, the used car salesman, in his ideal world, would get your money and keep the car. And in your ideal world, you'd get the car and you wouldn't give any money. But you wouldn't be talking to the used car salesman if that was going to be the outcome. So the agreement finally is, if it works and you come to a price you think is fair, then you get the car, he gets the money. You're better off with more car than you had before. He has more money than he has before. You're both better off. Neither of you is optimally better, best off, but you're better off. And you just multiply these kinds of arrangements throughout your life. And it's not only in the economic realm, right? So I think that's what we need to be returning to, is the thought that when we're doing politics, we're doing something more like buying a used car and less like we're at a football match. And I think that is the breakthrough that we need to have. I think the problem is people come now to the political domain with the sense that I'm supposed to get everything that I want, my sense of justice, my sense of how things ought to be. Whereas that's not going to happen because we live in now pluralistic communities. Even in ancient Athens was a pluralistic community in meaningful sense. So we can, in fact, create public goods, and we can each do better as individuals, but only by making positive sum bargains and rejecting the idea that politics is the right place for zero-sum bargains.
Question for about your wife, Adrienne Meyer. She's a distinguished historian of ancient science and folklore. I read that in the summer of 1978, you took an extraordinary field trip together, walking, busing, and hitchhiking along the rugged frontiers of ancient Athens. Was that your first field trip? What did you think about seeing the ruins of ancient Greece for the first time?
So, quite right. My now wife, Adrienne Meyer, and I moved to Athens in 1978 when I was still in graduate school. It was my first time ever to leave the United States. And I traveled through much of Europe and ended up in Athens. And we began doing field trips into the countryside because I was interested at that time in the system of ancient fortifications that had been built on the borderlands of Athens after the Peloponnesian War. It was just a kind of a magical time. I mean, one could sort of walk freely through the Greek countryside, take photographs, do simple measurements of some of these sites. Some of them were well known, others had fallen off the map, as it were. Perhaps had been discovered back by someone in the 18th or 19th century and hadn't been visited again. So it was spectacular. It brought Greece alive to me. I had fallen in love with, as I said, the idea of Greek history. But when I first visited the Greek countryside, then got to know Greek people, talking with shepherds in the field, asking them, are there any sort of big blocks? Oh yes, you should go up to. It was absolutely a splendid time. And Adrienne Meyer, my wife, and I were doing this always together. And she was always taking notes on the things that she cared about, and I was taking notes on things I cared about. And we each then were able to make a career out of that.
Here we are very interested about science, and you have often lauded your wife's study of ancient dreams of technology and ancient scientific wonders. Have you learned something from her about the role of science in the democratic societies of antiquity?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, one of the really lucky things in a man's life is to have a partner who is not only a companion of life, but is a companion of your mind.
Yes, yes.
And so, yes, Adrienne's just immense curiosity about the scientific world, and the ways in which scientific curiosity is not only something that scientists have, but it's something that ordinary people have. One of her real breakthroughs was the idea that it's false to think that there is a scientific approach that is unique to science. That ultimately, her argument has been that ordinary people have the same kind of curiosity that is manifest in very disciplined ways by modern science, and with all kinds of remarkable results, but still that same curiosity for what is it that explains some odd phenomenon, something that's different. So, for example, she began to be obsessed with the idea that Greeks must have had some idea about giant bones and skulls of creatures that we now know to be long extinct, which would be found by farmers that when they're plowing their fields. What on earth were they thinking about? And instead of just saying, well, they weren't thinking about much of anything because, it falls out of the ordinary. It's not about, growing like olive trees or something. She recognized that they had to come up with explanations for these, and they did. And that really intersects the world of Greek folklore, or we call it mythology, and the observation of anomalies in the natural world, and the attempt to come up with a plausible explanation for how these anomalous things, these bones that are way too big for any existing animal, could have come into being. So it was talking with Adrian over the years helped me to think not only about how ordinary people can be citizens, can organize their political lives together, but how ordinary people manifest the same kind of curiosity, and attempt to make sense of the world around them that we think of as unique to science.
In a speech you gave recently, you quoted the provost of Stanford, left-wing man, who said that American universities have a big problem because they have become an ideological monoculture of the left. When intellectual ecosystems lose diversity, what happens to the democratic culture?
I think that it's absolutely essential for democracy to have really genuine dialogue across difference. I think this is true of certainly for science. Science needs to have critique in order to advance. But I think an intellectual world like university absolutely has to have critique across ideological difference. So if we all agree too much within an academic world about what the right form of social organization is, we're going to be driving out the chance of so we end up in a monoculture, which can be very efficient about producing large amounts of one kind of thing, like agricultural monocultures, but also then drive out all of the biodiversity or intellectual diversity that ultimately makes for a really rich ecology. So I think that even those who are committed to ideals of the left, or for that matter, the right, ought to welcome interchange with people whose views are other than their own, and ought to recognize them as intellectual partners in a common enterprise of trying to do as well as we can together as a diverse, pluralistic community, which is true politically as well as intellectually.
Some, like Yuval Noah Harari, argue that modern democracy only works with the full liberal package. Individual rights, rule of law, minority protections, free speech, strong institution. Otherwise, it slides into tyranny with a ballot box. Your view, as I understand it, is that democracy has its roots in collective self-rule, and liberal rights strengthen it, but aren't foundational. And does today's polarization also come from confusing the two traditions?
So I think one of the questions is, what are the fundamental conditions necessary for democracy, and then what kind of rights, what kind of ways of living together are supported by democracy. So I think if we think of democracy as self-governance by a community and a reasonably diverse, at least in some sense, community of citizens, then the condition of free speech, I think, is necessary, because if we don't have free speech, whoever controls speech is acting as the boss of those who are controlled. And if we say democracy is no boss, then we've lost. So that free speech, free association, basic sense of equality of influence. So if we say that because you have a higher education than I do, you should have 1,000 votes and I have 1 vote, once again, you're ultimately, or your type is going to be my boss. And so, once again, we've lost the idea of no boss. So there are fundamental conditions that we now have reified as rights, and I think that's a very reasonable way to think about them as rights. But then we multiply other rights out of these fundamental conditions and imagine them as being inherent in our very humanity. And I think one of the questions then is, what are the fundamental conditions necessary for self-governance? And then what are the, as it were, superstructure of more rights, maybe economic rights, maybe right of healthcare and so on, that can be supported by this foundation, but are not necessarily built into the foundation. So personally, I'm very happy to live in a liberal democracy. I would not want to live in ancient Athens, much as I find it fascinating. But I think it's important to recognize that some of the apparatus that we've built up from democracy is in fact not at the base. It's not the foundation. And that at some point, it's possible to build the superstructure high enough so it begins to become tottering. And if we then say, we can't give up any of the entire structure without, giving up everything, then maybe we're in trouble. I think it seems to me some value to imagine a fundamental foundation of democracy that you cannot give up, conditions you cannot give up unless you're willing to give up on democracy entirely.
Quick question. If you could bring back one of the aspects of ancient Greek democracy in today's words, what would it be?
So the one I've been toying around with these days, and perhaps it's not the right one to have, but I'd rather like it, is the institution of ostracism. So once a year in Athens, the Athenians asked themselves, in a public assembly, it was mandated that this was on the agenda of the citizen assembly, to which any citizen could attend, should we this year expel one member from our community for a period of 10 years, can come back after 10 years, doesn't affect his property or his family or anything else, but he's out. He can't have any part in our civic life for 10 years. Should we do that? If we vote by a majority, yes, we should this year. And there's a second vote whereby each of us, if we were Athenians, brings to the public square a sherd of pottery on which we've written the name of the individual that we think should be expelled. And whoever gets a plurality of votes is expelled. There's no trial. It's not that they're guilty of anything. They're just thought to be the person who is most worthy of being expelled from our community. If we look at how this works, it could go really wrong, right? But it's only once a year that we get to make the decision. And if we look at what happens in Athens, it was very rare that they ever said we should have an ostracism this year. Only at the outside, about 15 times the decision was yes in 180 years of the robust democracy. So most years they said, no ostracism necessary. But the fact that an ostracism could be held was, in a sense, a constraint on the leaders. Every popular leader, every politician knew that if he became too obstreperous, shall we say, he could in fact be the subject of an ostracism. So it was kind of a dampening effect on the tendency of political leaders to, well, become populist tyrants.
Absolutely. Have you already have you already thought of what area of research on what research question you'd like to use the funding from the Balzan Prize?
Yes, so the project that I've proposed, I call the Phili project. Phili was the stronghold that was the rallying point of the Athenian Democrats after the loss of democracy in 404 BCE at the end of the Peloponnesian War. That's a long story, but ultimately an oligarchic government seized power. The Democrats, relatively few initially, took control of this stronghold in the mountains north of Athens called Phili. From Phili, they eventually recaptured the port city of Piraeus and eventually recaptured the whole of the community, and democracy was restored. So the project is really about the crisis of democracy, and then how is democracy restored after the collapse of democracy. I want to emphasize the thought that democracy is not just a once and forever thing. We are not at the end of history, that there is going to continue to be push and shove to and fro, and that even the loss of democratic institutions does not mean the loss of the idea of democracy, that the duties of the citizen potentially are retained in a time of a democratic overthrow. So the Phili project is about how is democracy restored? What are the historical antecedents to this? What are the ethical duties of a citizen in a time of democratic crisis?
We have one very last question at this podcast that we have, and I'll show you this image.
Okay.
This is a mystery box.
Very
it's
good.
A box made of cardboard, but it's sealed. We don't know what's inside. We have no idea what it is. But if you could just imagine that inside this box is the answer to a question, a riddle, a mystery, something that you have ever wondered about.
Yes.
What answer would there be in this box?
Okay. So there are so many. But how about this one? What did Socrates really say to the supporters who came to him and said to him after the trial, after he was condemned, guilty, what did he really say to them about his responsibility as a citizen? According to Plato, he said, the laws say I may not leave Athens. I may not, you want to break me out of prison. I may not do that. I may never disobey the law. But what was he really saying? What was that last conversation that Socrates had with his friends? So I'd like to be there and hear that. And
let's imagine that the answer is in this kind of box. Would you open it, or would you wait to find out maybe for yourself?
Yes. I think I'd have to open it.
Yes,
I have to know. I really have to be there. Even though I might be very disappointed. Because, of course, Socrates might have just said, let's just talk about what my last meal would be. Now, do I really want olives, or do I want how disappointed will I be? But still, I need to know.
You need to know. Thank you, Professor Ober.
Thank you.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a real joy for me.